I watched in horror as Sheriff Karen twisted the valve open on my largest rainwater tank. Thousands of gallons of precious water gushed onto the ground while she smiled that cold, satisfied smile. Behind me, I could hear Mrs. Chen crying as she watched months of garden planning wash away in muddy rivers across my property. Karen looked directly at me and said the words that still haunt me today. Maybe next time you will think twice before challenging my authority. That was the moment I realized this was never about water regulations. This was war. 3 years ago, I moved to this quiet corner of rural Montana with nothing but a dream and a determination to live sustainably. The previous owner had left behind a small farmhouse on 12 acres of beautiful rolling land. The first thing I noticed was how little rain we got during the growing season. That was when I decided to build something special. I spent months designing and installing a rainwater collection system that would make any engineer proud. 7 blue tanks, each holding 1,000 gallons, connected by a network of gutters and pipes that captured every drop from my roof and 2 large outbuildings. The system cost me nearly $8,000 and countless weekends of backbreaking work. But when I watched those tanks fill during the spring rains, I knew it was worth every penny. The community garden started by accident. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, an elderly Korean War veteran's widow, mentioned that her fixed income made fresh vegetables a luxury she could barely afford. I had more water than I could use and more land than I could manage alone. The solution seemed obvious. "Why do we not start a garden together?" I asked her one sunny May morning. "I have the water, you have the knowledge, and together we can grow enough food for both our families." Word spread quickly through our small community. Within a month, we had 12 families participating in what we proudly called the Mountain View Community Garden. Tom Rodriguez, a Vietnam veteran struggling with PTSD, found peace working in the soil. Single mother Janet Williams brought her 3 children every evening after work, teaching them where food really comes from. The Patel family, recent immigrants from India, shared seeds from their homeland that produced the most beautiful eggplants I had ever seen. Every Saturday morning became a celebration. Families would arrive with coffee and homemade pastries, spending hours weeding, planting, and sharing stories. The children would run between the rows while their parents planned the next week's planting schedule. By midsummer, we were harvesting enough vegetables to supply every participating family and still have surplus to donate to the local food bank. The garden represented more than just food security. It was proof that neighbors could work together, that self-sufficiency was possible, and that community bonds could flourish even in our increasingly divided world. My rainwater system was the heart that kept it all alive. That was when Sheriff Karen Morrison first appeared on my property. It was a Tuesday morning in late July when her patrol car pulled into my driveway. I was checking the water levels in my tanks when I heard the car door slam with more force than necessary. Karen walked toward me with the kind of swagger that immediately put me on edge. She was a tall woman in her early 50s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that seemed to be constantly searching for something to criticize. "Good morning, officer," I said, wiping my hands on my work shirt. "Is there something I can help you with?" "Sheriff Morrison," she corrected sharply. "I am conducting routine inspections of properties in this district. I need to ask you some questions about your water collection system." Her questions felt oddly specific and intrusive. How much water did the tanks hold? When had I installed them? Did I have permits? Had I consulted with the county about environmental impact? She walked around my property with a clipboard, taking notes and photographs with the methodical precision of someone building a case. Something about her demeanor made my stomach tighten with worry. This was not a routine inspection. This was reconnaissance. Sheriff Karen returned exactly 1 week later, and this time she was not alone. A thin man in an ill-fitting suit accompanied her, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the expression of someone who enjoyed delivering bad news. They approached my front door with the purposeful stride of debt collectors. "Mr. Peterson, I am Deputy County Administrator Walsh," the man announced before I could even say hello. "We need to discuss some serious violations we have discovered on your property." Karen stood behind him with her arms crossed, her badge catching the morning sunlight like a weapon. Her expression was cold and satisfied, as if she had been anticipating this moment for days. "Violations?" I asked, genuinely confused. "What kind of violations?" Walsh opened his briefcase and produced a thick folder stuffed with papers. "Your rainwater collection system violates County Ordinance 847B regarding unauthorized water retention structures. You are also in violation of Environmental Code 2347 concerning potential groundwater contamination risks." I stared at the papers he thrust toward me, trying to make sense of the dense legal language. The regulations seemed to have been written specifically to criminalize exactly what I had built. Every tank, every pipe, every connection was described as a potential environmental hazard requiring permits that I had never heard of. "I have never heard of these ordinances," I said slowly. "When were they enacted?" "Ignorance of the law is not a defense," Karen interjected with obvious satisfaction. "You have 48 hours to bring your property into compliance or face citations and potential criminal charges." The blood drained from my face as I realized what compliance meant. They wanted me to drain every tank and dismantle the entire system that 12 families depended on for their food security. Over the next few days, I threw myself into research, spending hours at the county courthouse reviewing records and regulations. What I discovered made my blood boil. The ordinances Walsh had cited were real, but they had been enacted just 3 months earlier in a late-night county commission meeting with minimal public notice. The meeting minutes showed that only 2 people had attended the public comment period, and both worked for local development companies. More disturbing was the pattern I uncovered when I started talking to my neighbors. Mrs. Patterson, who lived 5 miles down the road, told me about the organic farmer who had been driven out of business the previous year by sudden environmental violations. Mr. Chen shared stories of the Martinez family, whose solar panel installation had triggered a cascade of citations that eventually forced them to sell their property at a devastating loss. "She has been doing this for 2 years," Tom Rodriguez told me quietly as we stood in the garden, looking at plants that were already beginning to wilt in the summer heat. "Anyone who tries to live independently, anyone who does not fit her vision of how this county should look, she finds a way to make their life impossible." My research at the courthouse revealed one more disturbing fact. Sheriff Karen Morrison was married to David Morrison, a senior land acquisition specialist for Sunset Development Corp., the same company that had purchased the Martinez property, the Patterson farm, and 3 other foreclosed properties in our area over the past 18 months. The pieces were falling into place, painting a picture of corruption that went far deeper than water regulations. Karen was not just enforcing the law. She was systematically clearing out independent residents to make way for her husband's development projects. When I shared this information with the Garden families, the reaction was immediate and intense. Janet Williams burst into tears, realizing that her children might lose their source of fresh vegetables. The Patel family spoke in hushed, worried tones about what would happen if they were targeted next. Tom Rodriguez's hands shook with anger as he talked about fighting corruption overseas, only to find it thriving in his own backyard. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I made a decision that would change everything. If Karen wanted a fight, she was going to get one. The morning Karen came to destroy my water system dawned gray and humid, as if the sky itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was about to unfold. I had been awake since 4, packing my kitchen and watching the driveway for the convoy I knew was coming. At exactly 8 o'clock, 3 patrol cars pulled up to my house, followed by a county maintenance truck and Karen's personal vehicle. She emerged from her car like a general surveying a battlefield, adjusting her utility belt and surveying my property with obvious satisfaction. 2 deputies flanked her, along with Walsh and a county worker carrying a heavy toolbox. "Mr. Peterson," Karen announced loudly enough for the neighbors to hear, "by order of the County Environmental Protection Office, we are here to remediate the violations on your property." I had called everyone the night before, and they began arriving as Karen's team prepared their equipment. Mrs. Chen came first, clutching her granddaughter's hand and looking pale with worry. Tom Rodriguez pulled up in his old pickup truck, his jaw set with the kind of controlled anger that comes from years of military discipline. The Patel family arrived with their 3 young children, who immediately began asking questions about why the police were at the garden. "You cannot do this," I said, stepping forward with my phone to record what was happening. "These people depend on this water for their food. You are destroying their livelihood." Karen turned to face me with a smile that was purely predatory. "Mr. Peterson, if you interfere with official county business, I will place you under arrest for obstruction. I suggest you step back and let us do our job." The county worker began connecting a large pump to the first tank while Karen supervised with her clipboard. I watched in horror as the pump roared to life and began drawing water from the tank I had spent weeks installing and months filling. The precious water that should have sustained dozens of families through the harvest season gushed out through a thick hose, forming a growing lake of mud across my property. Mrs. Chen began crying as she watched months of careful garden planning wash away in brown torrents. Her granddaughter, 8-year-old Sarah, tugged at her sleeve and asked, "Grandma, why are they killing our vegetables?" "Because some people do not understand the importance of community," Mrs. Chen replied, her voice breaking with emotion. Karen overheard and turned toward the elderly woman with contempt. "Ma'am, if your family wanted food security, you should have planned better instead of depending on illegal water systems. This is what happens when people think they can ignore county regulations." Tom Rodriguez stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Those regulations were written to drive us out, and you know it. This has nothing to do with environmental protection." "Sir, I am going to need you to calm down and step back," Karen replied, her hand moving instinctively toward her service weapon. "You are becoming agitated, and I am concerned about public safety." The threat was clear and calculated. Karen was hoping someone would give her an excuse to escalate the situation, providing justification for arrests that would further destroy our community's ability to resist. Tank after tank was drained while our neighbors watched in stunned silence. 7,000 gallons of water soaked into the ground, creating a swamp where my carefully maintained property had been just hours before. The sound was obscene, thousands of gallons gurgling away while our region faced its 3rd consecutive year of drought conditions. Janet Williams arrived with her 3 children just as the 5th tank was being emptied. Her youngest son, barely 5 years old, began crying when he saw the muddy destruction where his favorite tomato plants had been thriving just days before. "Mommy, what happened to our garden?" he asked through his tears. Janet knelt down and hugged him close, but she had no answer. What could she tell him? That sometimes adults with badges destroy beautiful things because they can. That power and corruption sometimes win over community and cooperation. Karen completed her checklist with visible satisfaction, handing me a citation for over $3,000 in fines and cleanup costs. Mr. Peterson, you have 30 days to restore this property to county-approved conditions and remove all unauthorized water retention equipment. Failure to comply will result in additional citations and possible criminal charges. As the county convoy drove away, leaving only tire tracks and devastated neighbors behind, I stood in the mud where my water tanks had been and made a promise to myself and to my community. This was not over, not by a long shot. The war Sheriff Karen had started was about to become a battle she would never forget. That evening, my living room transformed into something I had never expected to see: a command center for community resistance. Word had spread quickly through our small network of neighbors, and by 7 o'clock, 23 people had gathered around my coffee table, which was now covered with laptops, legal documents, and notepads filled with angry scribbles. Mrs. Chen sat in my best chair, still pale from the morning's trauma, but with steel in her eyes that I had never seen before. She held her granddaughter Sarah on her lap while the child colored pictures of the destroyed garden. Tom Rodriguez had brought his military discipline to bear on the situation, organizing our group into focused teams with specific tasks and objectives. "We need to understand exactly what we are dealing with," Tom said, spreading county maps across my dining room table. "This is not random harassment. This is a systematic campaign with specific goals." Janet Williams had been researching on her laptop for hours, taking notes and cross-referencing property records with development permits. Her discoveries were both fascinating and terrifying. "Look at this pattern," she said, pointing to red dots she had marked on the map. "Every property that Karen has targeted in the past 2 years has been purchased by Sunset Development within 6 months of the harassment campaign. The Martinez Farm, the Patterson Organic Operation, the Johnson Solar Installation, all of them." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. We were not dealing with overzealous law enforcement. We were dealing with organized corruption designed to clear out independent residents and make way for development projects. Young Maria Patel, barely 18 but studying journalism at the community college, had been documenting everything on her phone and social media accounts. "We need to get this story to someone with a bigger platform," she said. "Local corruption only survives when it stays local." That was when Tom mentioned Sarah Martinez, a freelance journalist who had been investigating rural development schemes across the state. She had won awards for her work exposing similar corruption in other counties, and she lived just 2 hours away. "I served with her brother in Afghanistan," Tom explained. "She knows how these operations work, and she has connections with editors who will take this seriously." While Maria worked on contacting Sarah Martinez, the rest of us began documenting our individual experiences with Karen's harassment. The stories that emerged painted a picture of systematic intimidation that went far beyond my water tanks. Mrs. Patterson, who had driven over from her small apartment in town, told us about the bird feeding station that had triggered 3 months of environmental citations before she finally gave up and moved. The elderly woman had been feeding birds for 40 years, but Karen decided the feeders constituted an environmental hazard that required permits and inspections. Mr. Johnson shared his experience with solar panel harassment, describing how Karen had cited him for electrical violations, aesthetic complaints, and environmental concerns, until the legal fees and stress forced him to sell his property at a loss. "She always finds something," he said bitterly. "If it is not environmental, it is electrical. If it is not electrical, it is aesthetic. She keeps coming back until you either comply completely with her vision or you break under the financial pressure." The most disturbing revelation came from Tom Rodriguez, who had been quietly investigating Karen's enforcement patterns for months. He had discovered that Karen's property included several additions and modifications that would have triggered massive citations if applied to anyone else. She has an unpermitted workshop, a private pond that was never approved by environmental officials, and electrical work that was done without county inspection, Tom said. Her own property violations are more serious than anything she has cited us for. As the evening progressed, our group evolved from a collection of frustrated neighbors into a coordinated resistance movement. We established secure communication channels, assigned research responsibilities, and began planning for a public confrontation that would expose Karen's corruption to the entire county. Sarah Martinez agreed to drive down the following weekend to interview community members and investigate the development connections. Maria Patel would coordinate social media documentation and outreach to regional news outlets. Tom Rodriguez would handle legal research and coordinate with the retired civil rights attorney he had contacted earlier. My role was to serve as the primary spokesperson and coordinate the overall strategy. It was a responsibility I had never wanted, but one that circumstances had forced upon me. As our neighbors left that night, each carrying specific assignments and renewed determination, I realized that Karen had made a critical miscalculation. She had assumed that destroying our water system would break our community's spirit and force us to scatter in different directions. Instead, she had created something far more dangerous to her corruption: a unified group of citizens who were angry, organized, and determined to expose the truth. Sarah Martinez arrived the following Saturday morning with the kind of professional equipment and focused intensity that immediately made our community organizing feel more serious and legitimate. She was a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a direct manner of speaking that inspired confidence. Her laptop bag contained recording equipment, cameras, and folders full of background research she had already compiled about Sunset Development Corp. "I have been tracking this company for 8 months," she told us as we gathered in my living room for what had become our regular strategy meeting. "Your situation fits a pattern I have seen in 4 other counties across the state. They use local officials to create regulatory pressure that forces property sales. Then they acquire the land at below-market prices through connections that are technically legal but ethically questionable." The evidence Sarah had uncovered was damning and extensive. Financial disclosure records showed that David Morrison, Karen's husband, had received performance bonuses directly tied to property acquisitions in our county. County Commission meeting minutes revealed that Sunset Development had been granted zoning variances and permit approvals with unusual speed and minimal public oversight. Most disturbing was the timeline Sarah had constructed showing the relationship between Karen's enforcement campaigns and subsequent property sales. In every case, harassment had begun within weeks of Sunset Development expressing interest in a particular area, and property acquisitions had followed within months of residents giving up their legal battles. "This is not coincidence," Sarah explained, spreading photographs and documents across my dining room table. "This is a coordinated scheme that has been operating for at least 3 years. Karen provides the regulatory pressure, the county provides the legal framework, and Sunset Development provides the financial incentive." Tom Rodriguez had been conducting his own surveillance and investigation of Karen's property, using skills learned during his military service. His discoveries added another layer of hypocrisy to the corruption we were exposing. Her workshop was built without permits in 2019, Tom reported, showing us photographs taken with a telephoto lens. The electrical work was done by her brother-in-law, who is not a licensed electrician. The private pond she built last year required environmental permits that were never filed or approved. The pond was particularly egregious because Karen had cited 3 other residents for water retention violations that were far less significant than her own unauthorized construction project. Maria Patel had been documenting everything on social media and building connections with environmental and civil rights organizations across the region. Her efforts were beginning to generate attention from advocacy groups who specialized in rural corruption and development abuse. The Montana Environmental Justice Coalition wants to send a representative to our county commission meeting, Maria announced during one of our evening planning sessions. They have lawyers who specialize in selective enforcement cases. Meanwhile, I had been working with James Washington, the retired civil rights attorney Tom had contacted. James was a distinguished black man in his 70s who had spent decades fighting institutional corruption and discrimination. His experience and legal knowledge added credibility and strategic thinking to our resistance efforts. The key to winning this fight, James explained during our first meeting, is not just proving that Karen is corrupt. We need to demonstrate that her corruption violates constitutional principles of equal protection and due process. When local officials enforce regulations selectively based on personal gain, they are violating fundamental civil rights. James had identified several legal strategies that could challenge not just Karen's actions, but the entire system that enabled her corruption. Civil rights violations could trigger federal investigation and oversight that would be impossible for county officials to ignore or suppress. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Sarah Martinez discovered connections between Sunset Development and county officials beyond just Karen's husband. County Commissioner Bradley Walsh, the same man who had accompanied Karen to my property, owned stock in a construction company that had been awarded several lucrative contracts for Sunset Development projects. "This is bigger than we initially realized," Sarah told us during what would be our final planning meeting. "We are not just dealing with one corrupt sheriff and her developer husband. We are dealing with a network of connected officials who have been enriching themselves at the expense of rural residents for years." The scope of the corruption was both overwhelming and encouraging. Overwhelming because it revealed how deep the problem went, but encouraging because it meant that exposing the truth would have an impact far beyond just stopping Karen's harassment of our community. As we prepared for the county commission meeting that would serve as our public platform for exposing the corruption, I felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation that reminded me of the moments before a big exam or job interview. Everything we had worked for over the past month would depend on our ability to present our evidence clearly and compellingly to a public audience. The stakes could not have been higher, and failure was not an option. The county commissioners' meeting on Tuesday evening drew the largest crowd in the building's history. Our community organizing had been so effective that we filled every seat in the usually empty meeting room, with additional people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The energy was electric and barely contained, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. Sarah Martinez had positioned herself strategically near the front with professional recording equipment, while Maria Patel, and several other community members used smartphones to document everything from multiple angles. Tom Rodriguez sat with military-straight posture in the front row, a folder of evidence balanced on his lap. Mrs. Chen held her granddaughter's hand in the second row, both wearing their best church clothes for what they understood to be a historic occasion. Sheriff Karen Morrison sat at a table reserved for county officials, clearly uncomfortable with the packed room and hostile atmosphere. She kept glancing toward the exits and checking her phone, as if hopping for an emergency call that would provide an excuse to leave. Her husband David sat beside her, looking pale and nervous as he recognized several property owners his company had targeted over the past 2 years. When the meeting was called to order, Commissioner Bradley Walsh looked visibly shaken by the crowd's size and media attention. The local newspaper had sent a reporter, and Sarah Martinez's presence had attracted attention from regional news outlets who were covering the story remotely through social media feeds. "We have several items on tonight's agenda," Walsh announced, his voice slightly unsteady. "We will begin with public comment period, and I see we have quite a few people signed up to speak." My name was first on the list, a position I had specifically requested so that I could set the tone and context for everything that would follow. As I walked to the podium, the room fell completely silent except for the clicking of cameras and scratching of reporters' pens. "My name is Michael Peterson, and 3 weeks ago Sheriff Karen Morrison destroyed my rainwater collection system that supplied water to a community garden feeding 12 families in our area," I began, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I had rehearsed this presentation dozens of times, but nothing had prepared me for the intensity of speaking to a packed room while cameras recorded every word. I began with photographs of the thriving community garden, showing the faces of children and elderly residents who depended on fresh vegetables for their nutrition and well-being. Sheriff Morrison claimed this destruction was necessary to enforce county environmental regulations. I continued, advancing to the next slide in my presentation. What she did not tell us was that these regulations were enacted just 3 months ago in a late-night meeting with minimal public notice. The room began to murmur as I presented the timeline of regulatory changes, enforcement actions, and subsequent property acquisitions by Sunset Development Corp. The evidence was methodical and overwhelming, building a clear picture of coordinated corruption that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. Sheriff Morrison's own property includes violations more serious than anything she has cited our community for, I said, displaying Tom's surveillance photographs on the projection screen. Unpermitted construction, unauthorized electrical work, and environmental violations that would have resulted in thousands of dollars in fines if applied to any of us. Karen's face flushed red as the photographs of her property appeared on screen, and she began to fidget with her badge and utility belt. David Morrison looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor as his business connections were exposed to public scrutiny. The turning point came when I played audio recordings of Karen's threats and intimidation tactics, captured on my phone during her property visits. Her voice filled the meeting room as she made statements that revealed her true motivations and contempt for community members. "Maybe next time you will think twice before challenging my authority," her recorded voice echoed through the silent room. The audience's reaction was immediate and visceral. People gasped, shook their heads, and whispered angrily to their neighbors. Several commissioners looked genuinely shocked, as if they were hearing about Karen's behavior for the first time. Karen could not contain herself any longer. She jumped up from her chair and pointed an accusatory finger at me. This is a coordinated attack on law enforcement by people who refuse to follow county regulations, she shouted, her professional composure completely destroyed. These people are environmental criminals who are trying to destroy our community's development and prosperity. Her outburst was exactly what we had hoped for. The cameras captured every moment of her unprofessional behavior, while a room full of citizens witnessed her attacking community members who had done nothing but grow vegetables and collect rainwater. Tom Rodriguez stood up from his seat in the front row. "Sheriff, I am a combat veteran who served 3 tours in Afghanistan defending the Constitution you swore to uphold. The environmental criminal in this room is you." The room erupted in applause that lasted nearly a minute, despite Walsh's attempts to restore order. Karen's face went from red to purple as she realized that her authority meant nothing to a room full of citizens who had lost all respect for her badge. When Mrs. Chen stood up to speak, the room fell silent again. The elderly woman's voice was soft but clear as she described watching her granddaughter cry when the garden was destroyed. "I survived the Korean War and 40 years of poverty to find peace in this community," she said. "Sheriff Morrison has taken that peace away from children who never hurt anyone." Karen's response to Mrs. Chen was her final mistake. "Ma'am, if you cannot afford to buy your own food, that is not the county's problem. Maybe you should have made better life choices." The gasps of outrage from the audience were audible, and several people stood up spontaneously to express their disgust. The cameras captured every moment of Karen's callous dismissal of an elderly veteran's widow, creating footage that would haunt her career forever. Unable to defend herself against the overwhelming evidence and hostile crowd, Karen stormed out of the meeting while community members continued sharing their stories of harassment and intimidation. Her dramatic exit, captured by multiple cameras and broadcast live on social media, became the defining image of our victory over corruption and abuse of power. The aftermath of our public confrontation exceeded every expectation we had dared to hold. Sarah Martinez's article was published within hours of the meeting, and by Wednesday morning, it had been shared across social media platforms by thousands of people who recognized similar patterns of corruption in their own communities. The headline read, "Sheriff's Corruption Exposed. Community Garden Destroyed in Land Grab Scheme," and the story quickly gained national attention as an example of rural development abuse and selective law enforcement. The photograph of Karen storming out of the meeting while Mrs. Chen sat quietly in the front row became a powerful symbol of the contrast between arrogant authority and dignified resistance. By Thursday, regional television news crews were requesting interviews with community members, and by Friday, our story had been picked up by national outlets focusing on rural corruption and environmental justice issues. The hashtag #SheriffKaren began trending on social media platforms as people shared their own stories of abuse by local officials. The county commissioners, suddenly facing intense public scrutiny and media attention, announced an emergency meeting for the following Monday to address what they called serious allegations of misconduct and potential conflicts of interest. Commissioner Walsh, clearly panicked by the attention, issued a statement promising thorough investigation and appropriate action to restore public trust. Behind the scenes, the pressure was building from multiple directions. The Montana Environmental Justice Coalition had filed formal complaints with state oversight agencies, triggering investigations that would examine not just Karen's actions, but the entire system of permits, regulations, and enforcement in our county. James Washington, our civil rights attorney, had been in contact with federal officials who expressed interest in investigating potential constitutional violations and civil rights abuses. The selective enforcement patterns we had documented suggested systematic discrimination that could trigger federal oversight and intervention. Most importantly for our immediate concerns, the county quickly approved emergency permits for my rainwater collection system, suddenly discovering that the regulations Karen had enforced so aggressively were subject to interpretation and administrative discretion. The same officials who had threatened me with criminal charges were now offering expedited approvals and technical assistance. Sheriff Karen Morrison was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of multiple investigations. The official statement cited administrative concerns and the need to maintain public confidence in law enforcement, but everyone understood that her career in law enforcement was effectively over. Sunset Development Corp. found itself facing uncomfortable questions from investors and regulatory agencies about their property acquisition methods and relationships with local officials. Several planned development projects were placed on hold, while environmental and legal reviews were conducted with the kind of scrutiny that had been absent during Karen's reign of selective enforcement. The community garden, meanwhile, began its resurrection with an outpouring of support that far exceeded our original vision. Local businesses donated materials and labor for improved irrigation systems, raised beds, and a storage shed for tools and equipment. The county extension office offered technical assistance and educational programs that attracted visitors from neighboring communities. More families requested to join the garden project, expanding our membership from 12 to nearly 30 households within a month of the public meeting. The destroyed system that Karen had thought would end our community cooperation had instead become the foundation for something larger and more resilient than we had ever imagined. The irony was not lost on any of us that Karen's attempt to destroy our self-reliance had resulted in stronger community bonds, better infrastructure, and more public support than we had ever enjoyed before her harassment campaign began. Justice, it seemed, sometimes arrives through the unexpected path of community resistance and public accountability. 6 months after Sheriff Karen Morrison drained my rainwater tanks, she submitted her resignation in disgrace, rather than face the criminal charges that prosecutors were preparing to file. The letter was brief and filled with self-pity, claiming that she had been unfairly targeted by environmental extremists and anti-development activists who refused to respect law and order. The criminal charges came anyway. The state attorney general's office, under pressure from federal investigators and environmental justice advocates, filed charges for abuse of office, conspiracy to violate civil rights, and corruption in connection with the Sunset Development scheme. Karen's husband David faced separate charges for his role in the property acquisition conspiracy. The trials would take months to complete, but the immediate result was the dismantling of the corrupt system that had terrorized independent residents across our county for years. New policies required public hearings for regulatory changes, established citizen review boards for enforcement complaints, and created clear procedures for challenging citations and administrative actions. Commissioner Bradley Walsh, facing his own investigation for conflicts of interest, chose not to seek re-election. His replacement, Maria Patel, had been inspired by our community organizing to run for office herself. At 19, she became the youngest county commissioner in Montana history, elected on a platform of transparency, environmental protection, and support for sustainable living practices. The community garden had grown far beyond our original dreams. What started as a small cooperation between neighbors had become a regional model for food security and community resilience. School groups toured our expanded facility regularly, learning about sustainable agriculture, rainwater harvesting, and community cooperation. The new water system was 3 times larger than my original installation, with improved filtration, distribution, and storage capacity. County officials, eager to demonstrate their support for environmental sustainability, had helped secure grants and technical assistance that made the expansion possible. Mrs. Chen, now in her 80th year, had become something of a local celebrity. Newspaper articles described her as the grandmother who faced down a corrupt sheriff, and she received invitations to speak at community events across the region. Her granddaughter Sarah, now 9 years old, helped her manage a special section of the garden dedicated to traditional Korean vegetables and herbs. Tom Rodriguez had channeled his military skills and organizational experience into founding a nonprofit organization that helped rural communities resist development pressure and corruption. The Montana Rural Defense Coalition provided legal assistance, organizational training, and media support to communities facing similar challenges to what we had experienced. Janet Williams used her research skills and passion for justice to become a freelance investigative journalist, working with Sarah Martinez to expose corruption in other counties across the state. Her children, who had cried when their garden was destroyed, now understood that their mother was helping protect other families from similar attacks. The Patel family's story of immigration, community integration, and civic engagement had attracted attention from national media outlets exploring rural demographic changes and community building. Their success in our small community challenged stereotypes about rural attitudes toward diversity and immigration. As for me, I found myself in a role I had never expected or wanted: a public speaker, an advocate for community resilience and sustainable living. Invitations came from environmental groups, community organizations, and even government agencies seeking to understand how citizen organizing could address local corruption. The physical scars of Karen's attack on our property had long since healed. The muddy wasteland where thousands of gallons of water had been dumped was now the site of our expanded greenhouse and educational pavilion. The area where Karen's boots had trampled our first plantings was now home to a memorial garden honoring community members who had stood up to abuse of power. On quiet Saturday mornings, as I watched families working together in the garden their cooperation had created, I often thought about the lesson Karen had inadvertently taught us. She had intended to demonstrate that individual citizens were powerless against corrupt authority, that community cooperation could be destroyed by bureaucratic harassment, and that ordinary people should accept whatever treatment they received from officials with badges. Instead, she had proven exactly the opposite. She had shown us that communities could resist corruption when they worked together, that ordinary citizens could demand accountability from their officials, and that justice was possible when people refused to accept injustice as inevitable. The garden continued to thrive, feeding dozens of families and hosting hundreds of visitors each year. Children played between the rows while their parents planned next season's plantings. Elderly residents shared knowledge with young families learning to grow their own food. Recent immigrants contributed seeds and techniques from their homelands, while longtime residents shared stories of the land's history. Sheriff Karen Morrison had tried to destroy our community and failed completely. In her failure, she had helped us build something beautiful, sustainable, and stronger than anything we could have created without the motivation her corruption provided. Sometimes justice arrives through the front door with badges and handcuffs. Sometimes it grows quietly in community gardens, watered by the tears of neighbors who refuse to accept defeat.